Hi, everybody, and welcome to Citizens Housing and Planning Council's new lens for New York City's housing plan. Today, we're launching our housing plan for a city of immigrants. We're so excited to be here with you today with a great group of panelists. We have Michelle De La Uz from the Fifth Avenue Committee, Anu Joshi from the New York Immigration Coalition, Sheena Kang from CHPC, and Thomas Yu from Asian Americans for Equality, or AFI. I'm Jessica Katz. I'm the Executive Director of CHPC. I want to thank our sponsors today who have made this report and this project possible: Trinity Church Wall Street, Rockaville, Merchants Capital, New York Community Trust, the Altman Foundation, and JP Morgan Chase. Thank you so much from the bottom of our hearts. Before we get started, I want everyone to fill out the census form. If you haven't done so already, leave the Zoom room immediately, go take care of it, and then come right back. If you have done so already, I'm going to ask you to text 2 people who you suspect might have not been on top of it, and let them know that they have another 30 days to do it and they should do it right now. Please do this. It's the most important act of democracy you'll be able to do this year, second possibly to voting. Just to get a sense of who is in the room, the chat is open, and I want to make sure that everybody answers these 3 questions. So if you could all enter into the chat, where were you born, which country, where were your parents born, and where were your grandparents born? If everybody could do that for us so we could get a feel for who's in the room, that would be fantastic. Thank you so much. Before we get started with Housing Plan for City of Immigrants, I want to get started by talking a little bit about some of the projects that CHPC has been working on this year. The final countdown is a list of 5 projects that we think that the mayor should do before he leaves office. So for the next 15 months, he has a little bit of time left, and he'll be able to do these 5 things. We want him to rezone Soho for a more equitable New York City, launch an equity audit of the city's code enforcement practices to make sure we're doing as much equitable code enforcement as we can, and that our code enforcement is having the safety outcomes and the policy outcomes that we're looking for. Do some regulatory reform for basement apartment conversions, enable real decision-making at NYCHA, and create affordable housing for our essential workers. We have a project called Public Housing Revolution. We have some videos and some reports up on our website for you to check out, taking the example that we have from London and the UK and how we can examine that here in New York City. Import that here to make sure that NYCHA residents get a real say in what their future of public housing is going to look like. We think this is really critical for the reimagining of public housing here in New York City. We have a project called Housing Policy for a Global Pandemic. We had to really pivot when the coronavirus hit, and we had to really make sure that we knew what housing policy could achieve in terms of bringing us back on our feet, both for the health of our city and the economy of our city. So we have 10 policy recommendations for how to use housing policy to bounce back from COVID-19. One of the major ones is to talk about density in COVID. So at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a sense that there's something kind of inherently vulnerable about New York City. This is not true. Population density is not related to the spread of this virus in any way. In fact, this dates back to kind of century-old myths about cities being kind of sick and dirty and full of sick and dirty people. And it's really going to have a very negative effect on New York City's ability to recover economically. And even more importantly, it's going to create a false sense of security for people living in those low density areas that are being hit even harder by the pandemic. So take a look at that data that we've compiled about population density and COVID-19. And if you hear somebody questioning why you live in New York or thinking that they are safer because they live in a lower density area, I really encourage you to all challenge that. So today we're here to launch a project called New Lens for New York City's Housing Plan. The unit counting lens has kind of dominated the housing plans for several administrations now. And while I think it's an incredibly powerful management tool, I think it's run its course as a communication strategy. And it's not really a housing policy, right? It's a management tool. So while it really knows how to move mountains within the gears of city government, it doesn't answer the question of why, for who, where. So the New Lens for New York City's housing plan is CHPC's answer to that problem. So we're taking a look at housing policy through a variety of different lenses and really taking a look to see what would the answers be. There are some housing problems that face different sub-communities in our city. There are problems that face all of our communities in our city, but we have to really answer, why are we doing this and who is this for? So today we're launching into the first of those, Housing Plan for a City of Immigrants. You should have all gotten an email this morning with the full report, and we'll share the highlights here with you today. 2 weeks from today is our next event in this series, entitled What the F is a Feminist Housing Plan? So Thursday, October 1st at 10 a.m. You can register now on our website or check your inbox for emails from us about more details about the next event. So now I want to introduce Sheena Kang. She's a senior policy analyst here at CHPC and the author and mastermind of the Housing Plan for a City of Immigrants, and she's going to walk you through. Then we'll have a panel discussion, and then we'll have a Q&A with the audience. So get your questions ready in the Q&A section. Thank you all so much for coming. Over to Sheena.
Thanks, Jessica. And thank you everyone for joining us today. So I'm really excited to share with you guys our housing plan for City of Immigrants. And first I'd like to just talk about why we decided to do this lens, why a housing plan for a City of Immigrants, right? When you're thinking about all the different public policy goals that housing policy could be leveraged to achieve. Supporting New York's immigrant communities might seem like, you know, a niche issue or one that only affects a small percentage of the population, but that is actually very far from the truth. Immigration has always been a major force behind New York City's growth and success. Immigrants founded New York City. They were a large part of why we grew to the size that we did and became as important as we did economically and culturally within the United States. And even more recently, in the 1970s, when so many former hubs of industry in the Northeast, New York City included, were starting to see massive population loss and economic decline, a massive resurgence in immigration to New York enabled us to transition out of that downward spiral and become the amazing city that we know to be today. So when we're thinking about our immigrant city today, immigrants not only account for 37% of the workforce, of the population, but also 45% of the workforce. Half of the grocery stores, bodegas, and other small businesses that we rely on to meet our daily needs are owned by immigrant New Yorkers. And beyond the economic contributions of immigrants to the city, immigrants also play a huge role in the families and households of hundreds of thousands of US-born residents, with half of the city's households including at least one foreign-born member. So a City of Immigrants lens and public policy through an immigration lens is not just a social equity issue, even though that achieving a quality of life and equal access to opportunity for immigrant communities is of course an important social equity goal. This is also something that affects every New Yorker, regardless of where they're from. It's about ensuring that our city's economic engine and lifeblood continues to run in the way that it has. This is especially important right now. The role of local policy in the current federal climate is especially important right now. Some of my colleagues are going to get into the ongoing threats to immigrant New Yorkers by the federal government and the disproportionate impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on immigrant communities. But I will just say that we have been seeing a decline in immigration to New York over the past couple of years for the first time in decades. And so the role of local policy in stepping up to meet the needs of immigrants is really critical at this moment. And then when we're thinking about meeting those needs, it's not just, you know, how do the needs of immigrant New Yorkers differ from those of US-born residents, it's also how do they vary across different groups and different communities. This map gives you a sense of the vast range of places that New Yorkers come from and all of the different communities that experience housing needs and quality of life in a different way. And then when we're thinking about citywide policy measures and interventions to support immigrant communities as well, you can see here immigrants live all over the city, but there are some neighborhoods in particular that rely on immigrant New Yorkers. And so it's important to consider how we can reach the neighborhoods and areas of the city that need the help the most. So thinking about housing plan for a city of immigrants, we kind of started just by looking at the unmet needs and trying to figure out, where has policy sometimes left immigrant communities out and not met their needs as well as it should. So these data points can give you a, just a brief sense of the disparities in access to quality of life and opportunity that exist. Immigrant New Yorkers earn less than US-born workers, although they have an equal rate of participation in the labor force, and that rate of participation is actually much higher for non-citizens and undocumented workers. And then likewise, immigrant households earn less, despite having on average more workers contributing to household income. And immigrant New Yorkers are more likely to be living in poverty or in overcrowded conditions. And this is an issue that stems from many factors, including the financial barriers that I just talked about, but also the limitations of a housing stock that is primarily designed for nuclear family households. Immigrant households are more likely to be multi-generational, and actually 65% of multi-generational households in the city are headed by immigrants. And then, of course, immigrant New Yorkers are more likely to experience language barriers or housing discrimination in the housing market. And so these are just a few of the issues that we are hoping to tackle in our housing plan, and that brings us to our goals. So we have a set of policy strategies that can kind of help advance each of these three goals to help support the future success and stability of our immigrant communities here in New York. So first, we want to promote equitable access to housing, unrestricted by nationality or legal status, break down financial barriers to accessing housing, language barriers, all the things that we just talked about. We want to provide flexible and diverse housing options that meet the needs of immigrant New Yorkers. So that's, facilitating the development of different housing typologies that can be better suited for all the diverse living and household arrangements that exist. And then finally, going back to the strengths of our immigrant population and their amazing contributions to the city, we need to leverage our housing policy to create more opportunities that allow the next generation of immigrant New Yorkers to thrive. So moving into our policy recommendations, first turning to housing access, we recommend expanding and streamlining language, translation, interpretation, and navigation services, both in the housing market and in housing court, so that immigrants are able to enforce their rights. Along with that, we recommend strengthening measures to combat housing discrimination, such as by providing reporting incentives for victims of discrimination, as well as building on existing and developing new community outreach and education initiatives so that immigrant households are well informed about their rights. To address the financial barriers to housing that I've spoken about, and also the implications for housing stability that those barriers carry, we recommend finding new ways to provide universally accessible rental assistance that all New Yorkers can access. Our rental assistance here in New York is currently restricted by immigration status due to federal restrictions on the funds that we use to provide rental assistance. So that in effect prevents many households from being able to access this critical resource. So we need to find new ways of providing rental assistance that can be that resource for any household that's experiencing housing instability and help prevent housing instability and homelessness. We also need to eliminate disparities in access to the city's subsidized affordable housing stock, which has been a core pillar of how New York City does housing policy for several years. But immigrant households are often in effect excluded from access to those units, either because they don't make enough to qualify for an income restricted unit, or because they lack the proper documentation, required documentation to prove their eligibility for a unit. Immigrant New Yorkers are more likely to be self-employed or work in cash-based economies and may not be able to provide the documentation that's required to verify income eligibility. So we need to open up new ways in the affordable housing lottery process that can be more inclusive of people of all types of employment. And then finally, as we are struggling to address the citywide housing shortage, we should target neighborhoods with large or growing immigrant populations for the creation of more affordable housing, both to help alleviate overcrowding and to reduce reliance on informal housing arrangements, which are very risky because they can create unsafe living conditions and also deprive occupants of leasehold rights. So by creating more affordable housing in immigrant neighborhoods, we can help reduce those issues, as well as provide more opportunities for newcomers to the city to live in communities where people are of a similar linguistic or cultural background, which is a huge asset to many new arrivals in New York for finding employment, finding housing, and being able to secure their livelihood here in the city. Thinking about better meeting the needs of immigrant New Yorkers through the housing stock, we aren't going to be able to meet those needs unless we really understand them. And right now, there's an elevated risk that our key sources of demographic data that we use to influence policymaking will be unreliable and allow for the needs of immigrant communities to be misunderstood or overlooked. So fill out your census forms and tell everyone to fill out their census form. And beyond that, moving forward, understanding this elevated risk, we can also build partnerships with the wealth of amazing CBOs and direct service providers here in the city that help immigrant New Yorkers access housing on a daily basis to better understand their housing needs and the barriers they face. We can do a better job of integrating the resources and information generated by the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs into all city agency work so that all public services and resources are taking into account the needs of immigrant communities. And then we can also use that data and improved understanding to, along with monitoring of fluctuating migration patterns in the city, prepare to meet the needs of immigrant communities that are rapidly growing, and also understand why some groups might be threatened, or where we need to step in and do a better job to ensure that we don't lose those communities. Even with the data that we do have, looking at the current housing stock, there are things that we can do right now. We know that enabling and incentivizing basement apartment conversions would definitely help meet the housing needs of immigrants, both by providing affordable rental housing options for underserved groups and bolstering the financial well-being of low and moderate income homeowners. Enabling a pathway to more basement apartment conversions would also help reduce the risks that are created in informal housing arrangements, such as unsafe living conditions. Immigrant communities are disproportionately impacted by overcrowding, partially as a result of the greater financial barriers they face, but also because of the lack of diversity in our housing options. So we need to be thinking about more housing options for single person households, which there's incredible unmet demand here for in the city. We can pursue regulatory reform to encourage the development of more studio and one bedroom apartments to help absorb that demand. And then we should also be exploring options for single person households, and particularly for those that are very low income or comprised of new or undocumented or older immigrants, such as a modern take on the SRO or shared housing typologies, which, if they are designed and managed well, can provide for many benefits, including deeper affordability than a traditional studio or one bedroom apartment, as well as increased flexibility for shorter term arrangements, and for people who may not have the savings or the proper required documents to sign a typical long-term lease. And then finally, thinking about new housing typologies, we really need to encourage the development of housing that is suitable for multi-generational households to live in. This is especially true with the fact that the older foreign-born population is the fastest growing population in the city right now, and our senior population citywide will soon be majority foreign-born. So we need to prepare to meet the needs of an aging immigrant population, including by preparing for more multi-generational household living arrangements. And then finally, turning to our last goal of leveraging more economic opportunities that allow immigrant communities to thrive. Homeownership is a key factor here, with some immigrant communities actually having much higher rates of homeownership than US-born residents, and then other groups having been largely excluded from that opportunity and not being able to access homeownership. So city down payment assistance programs are going to play a huge role here. If we are serious in New York City about helping low and moderate households achieve homeownership, we need to provide down payment assistance that can properly offset the extremely high cost of housing in New York City. And the current cap on down payment assistance for households is $40,000, which is just really not enough for most low and moderate income households to be able to make that leap. And then especially for immigrant households, a huge barrier to homeownership is lack of credit. And we need to be thinking about ways to develop and provide home loan products that are accessible to households that are financially ready to purchase a home and are demonstrably creditworthy, but have a low FICO score due to their lack of credit history. Lack of credit is a leading obstacle to homeownership for immigrant New Yorkers, but it doesn't have to be. We just have to think outside of the box a little bit, and there's already examples of this happening at the state level that we discuss in our report. Small business ownership has also been a huge opportunity that has allowed so many immigrant households to achieve success here in New York and has provided amazing benefits to the city. We need to ensure that the next generation of entrepreneurs is able to access small business ownership and also help protect the small business workers and owners that are really suffering from the economic impacts of COVID-19. So we will need to pursue some zoning reform to accommodate the increasingly blurry lines between residential and commercial space, given the effects of this pandemic. Everyone that usually works in an office has been working from home for several months, but many of those activities are actually not zoning compliant. So as we update our zoning and our regulatory framework to accommodate those circumstances, we also need to be thinking about how to help people outside the office setting and ensure that the next generation of entrepreneurs can become small business owners as well. And then finally, our last recommendation is around employer-assisted housing programs, which typically in New York City have in the past been limited more to homeownership opportunities for highly sought after employees, as well as the development of workforce housing by corporations. But there's new forms of employer-assisted housing on the rise in the global corporate economy with the Audibles of the world and many other companies like that in the New York area already offering rental subsidy and rental assistance to their staff to incentivize them to live close to work. So with that trend, we need to put measures into place now to ensure that low-wage workers at those companies are also going to benefit and be able to participate, and then do every effort to pair those with workforce development opportunities and career track opportunities for underserved communities. And this could be a part of the solution to help underserved communities that are typically left out from the benefits of citywide job growth and economic development participate in those benefits. And that is it for our housing plan for City of Immigrants. The link we will share after this presentation, and you can find the full housing plan online. I'd like to thank our wonderful sponsors again for all of their amazing support. And I'm excited to hear from our next panelist, Joshi from the New York Immigration Coalition. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Sheena. I'm so excited to be here and be a part of this panel. So as Sheena mentioned, my name is Anu, and I'm with the New York Immigration Coalition. And I'm going to provide a little bit of a 30,000-foot view of the kind of issues that are impacting immigrant New Yorkers in this moment. So as I'm sure all of you know, and won't surprise anyone, in almost every way, immigrants and their families have been some of the hardest hit by this pandemic and the ensuing response. Immigrants risk heightened exposure to COVID-19 as essential workers, and when sick, they've suffered higher mortality rates. Nowhere was that more visible than here in New York City in the first months of the pandemic, where Black and Latinx residents were twice as likely to die from COVID-19 than white residents. We also know that immigrants were an incredibly integral part of our essential workforce in the months following the pandemic and the ensuing shutdown. 1/3 of all essential workers in New York State are immigrants, and over half of all essential workers in New York City are foreign-born, are immigrants. Immigrants are also unfortunately overrepresented in the industries hardest hit by the economic downturn, and were therefore more likely to be left unemployed than their native-born counterparts. And so what we've seen, and I know this doesn't surprise anyone on this call, is that the COVID-19 pandemic has really just sharpened the already deep cleavages around race, class, and of course, immigration status, which has resulted in higher unemployment, lack of digital access, income loss, and deep economic instability, evictions, and poverty amongst immigrant New Yorkers. And so the urgency to create city and state-based long-term policy solutions for immigrant communities has only been increased tenfold. And this is especially true because of the federal government's shameful failure, really, to include immigrant families in any of the federal COVID-19 relief efforts that they've passed so far. Immigrant families were completely left out of the CARES Act, which provided stimulus checks to some American families, but left out undocumented immigrants, legal residents who were married to undocumented immigrants, children, US citizen children of undocumented parents. All undocumented immigrants don't qualify for unemployment or other benefits. We see that they're being left behind in our education system and our transfer to remote learning. The tools and resources that immigrant parents need to ensure that their children can thrive and be successful in a remote learning environment are just simply not available. And when we think about access to healthcare, New York State, after a lot of advocacy, took a really good position of allowing low-income undocumented immigrants to apply and receive emergency state Medicaid if they tested positive for COVID-19. But that doesn't, address the underlying problem, is that too many of our immigrant community members have no access to affordable, accessible healthcare. And of course, all of this is happening in the midst of unrelenting federal attacks on immigrant communities that did not start with COVID-19 and won't end at the end of this crisis. And in so many ways, what this presidential administration has focused on is how do we make life so miserable? How do we make immigrant communities suffer so much in order to advance a really white supremacist anti-immigrant agenda? And, many of these will probably sound familiar to you. One big one that has really impacted immigrant communities' ability to access services is the new updated public charge rule that was implemented actually in February of this year, right before the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And, there's a lot of confusion about what the public charge rule means, but what we know for sure is that the information about the public charge rule being out there in immigrant communities has led to a huge chilling effect of immigrant families taking advantage of the services that they need to survive, and has meant quite honestly, that families have suffered, that children have suffered, have not gotten the care that they needed because of this administration. Just a few others that I'll highlight, this Trump administration has attacked legal immigrants. They've tried to end the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals DACA program, which was provided a brief reprieve by the Supreme Court, but this Trump administration's Department of Homeland Security is not following the Supreme Court order. They've terminated temporary protected status protections, which again had a short reprieve from the Ninth Circuit, but was recently lifted. In the first weeks of the presidency, 3.5 years ago, we saw the institution of the Muslim ban. And, here in New York, we've seen how really ICE and Border Patrol have become terrorizing agencies. They are rogue agencies that are, some would say, and I'd probably agree, are operating as they were intended to, but to indiscriminately terrorize immigrant families. They engage in racial profiling, they harass families, and what it has meant that, long-standing New Yorkers who have raised families here, who have built businesses here, are being targeted and separated from their families. And then, as was mentioned at the top of the call, this administration is going at the very heart of the matter, trying to starve our communities from getting the resources they need from the federal government. And one way they're doing that is through the census and their attacks on a fair and accurate census count. So, we saw that from the very beginning with their illegal attempt to add a citizenship question to the census. The New York Immigration Coalition is proud to have been a named plaintiff in that case, took them to court and actually won in the Supreme Court to prevent that citizenship question from being added to the census. But, much of the damage had been done. And now we see that they are not fulfilling their obligations to count every person in the United States. And that has huge liability, huge implications on New York and the resources that we receive in order to serve all of our communities. So, in this broader context, the NYIC has a few areas that we really feel like New York City can act on immediately in order to improve the lives of immigrant New Yorkers and ensure that they're able to really survive and thrive in our community. The first one is to create an emergency cash assistance fund for those New Yorkers who were left out of the federal relief packages. And this includes, direct cash payments and help for small businesses for all of those families, many of whom are immigrant families who are struggling to make ends meet. We want to ensure that the city restores $12 million for adult literacy funding to address the immense inequitable gap in digital literacy, systems navigation skills, and access to information in English between immigrant parents and many other New Yorkers. We want to ensure that the city continues their historic commitment to funding immigration legal services to ensure that everyone is entitled to due process, even in immigration court. We want to ensure that the city's immigrants are able to access the health care that they need, whether that's through the city's insurance program, through Access Health New York City. We want to make sure that the city is investing in language interpretation, that they're expanding their paid sick leave law. And we want to empower immigrant New Yorkers to be able to participate in this democracy. And so, one of our big campaigns is expand voting rights in local New York City elections to green card holders and others who are authorized to legally work in the United States. And so these are some of the New York City policy priorities that NYIC has been focusing on to try to address the many ways in that immigrant communities are suffering right now. And we look forward to working with CHPC and to talk about how housing is an integral part of addressing all of these concerns. And so with that, I will now turn it over to Michelle from the Fifth Avenue Committee.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Anu, for all of that troubling information, and also for the leadership that the New York Immigration Coalition has shown in so many ways. And thank you to CHPC and to Jessica and to Sheena for broadening discussion about who we're building and preserving our housing for in New York City. So I'm Michelle Delaluz, the Executive Director of the Fifth Avenue Committee. FAC has been around for 42 years, advancing economic and social justice. And along with our affiliate Neighbors Helping Neighbors, which is based in Sunset Park, we are very attuned to the housing needs of that community. So I just want to do a brief deep dive into Sunset Park, which is it ranks 13th in New York City in terms of immigrant population. And about 44% of the community in Sunset Park is foreign born. And that number's actually gone down over the last 8 years. It used to be closer to 52% in 2010, really showing you some of the pressures, the gentrification and displacement pressures that have been happening in the community. About 40% of the neighborhood in Sunset Park is Latino and 31% Asian. And it's, in keeping with some of the recommendations that you heard Sheena outline, it's the fourth most overcrowded community board in the city. Fifth Avenue Committee recently came out with a report, a housing report outlining some of the dynamics that are going on in Sunset Park. So I just want to briefly go over some of the information, because I think it kind of highlights some of the reasons why the recommendation in CHPC's report are so important to immigrant communities. You can get this report on our website. So like a lot of immigrant neighborhoods in New York City, Community Board 7, which is predominantly Sunset Park, the population growth or the rate of growth in the community board is much higher either than New York City or than Brooklyn. Significant percentage of households are severely rent burdened, paying more than 50% of their income in rent. And when you look at the number of low-income households, the percentage is closer to 50% are paying more than 50% of their income in rent. Rents in the neighborhood are growing or higher than either New York City or Brooklyn. There's obviously a number of other conditions that are exacerbating that. The housing stock in the neighborhood is quite old. Some of it's beautiful, some of it's just old. As I said, it's the fourth most overcrowded community board. We've seen predatory investment when Tish was the public advocate. Silver Shore Properties was the #1 ranked worst landlord, and they had several properties in Sunset Park where Fifth Avenue Committee and Neighbors Helping Neighbors had been organizing. And we've seen a significant amount of tenant harassment that's gone on. Certainly immigrant communities, a lot of folks are unaware of their rights. And so a big part of what we do is help people understand that regardless of immigration status, that they do have rights as tenants. Certainly one of the things we should be thinking about is expanding the Certificate of No Harassment program, looking at the criteria for that program, and in particular, immigrant communities where harassment can really very quickly lead to displacement. The big thing also in Sunset Park was actually seeing a loss of housing units in the neighborhood in the last 8 years. Largely, this is 1 to 4 house, buildings that have been converted as higher income people come in. So that is definitely a trend that we're seeing in the community. There's, in general, the production of housing hasn't kept pace with demand, certainly not on the affordable housing side. Fifth Avenue Committee currently has 134 units of affordable housing in 2 separate projects in construction. That's the first new, in the case of our Sunset Park Library and Affordable Housing Project, that's the first new affordable housing for families in the community in more than 15 years, despite the significant population growth. So all of this is leading Fifth Avenue Committee to lay out some of our own recommendations, which I think dovetail nicely with a number of the things that CHPC outlined. Obviously, there's a pretty significant housing stock in the neighborhood that is affordable, and despite despite the wins that tenants have had on the rent stabilization in the state, especially during economic downturns, we've seen corporate landlords come in and buy properties and like hold them for a while until the conditions change and they can reposition them. So preserving the existing housing stock by mission-driven nonprofits is critical. Creating more 100% permanently affordable pipelines, and then in a targeted manner, not in a neighborhood-wide manner. Really thinking about how we can rezone to expand MIH in the community and other opportunities. And then of course, enhance and promote tenant protections, including the good cause eviction bill that's in Albany. All of these are critical. And I just want to combine one other idea, stop sharing for now. Combine one other idea that, we both Sheena and Anu talked about, the importance of the economic contributions of immigrants. And, as we think about what an equitable recovery will look like for New York City, and thinking in particular about how hard COVID has hit immigrant communities, thinking about combining funding and financing that target small business owners and homeowners, for those that want to, a new live-work concept, if you will, that's more focused on immigrants rather than artists, I think is an important one. And I'll just, mention that, FAC also has a couple other programs which specifically target immigrants. We have a bridge program that combines adult education and literacy with our sector-based training programs, working with over 200 immigrants a year. And I, want to do a shout out and thank the New York Immigration Coalition for their support on the emergency cash relief through their ECAP program. With that and some other investment, Fifth Avenue Committee has been able to help hundreds of local immigrants who've been both documented and undocumented, who've been excluded from other assistance. And then the digital bridge piece. We've been providing equipment, hotspots, and training to local residents, immigrants, public housing residents during this time to ensure that we can enfranchise people at this difficult moment. And I'll just say that I think a lot of the solutions on the housing side for immigrants are as much about policies and programs that are outside of housing as they are specific to housing. Such a significant portion, at least in the neighborhoods where Fifth Avenue Committee is, immigrants are living in privately owned housing because of the exclusions that we heard earlier. So protections and programs that really target tenants in privately owned housing are critically important as we think about how to have a more equitable and inclusive city. I'll stop there and I'll turn it over to Thomas Yu, co-executive director of AFI and a fellow NeighborWorks America member.
Thanks, Michelle. Thank everyone for
You're on mute, Thomas.
sorry there. Thanks, Michelle, for the introduction, and thank you, CHPC, for putting this together. We heard such alarming but illuminating data from our previous panelists, and also from the report that was put together by CHPC. I'm the co-executive director of Asian Americans for Equality. We're a 46-year-old community development organization, and we do a whole series of comprehensive wraparound services. We are a affordable housing developer and owner and operator, while also providing social services. We also run 2 CDFIs that do lending for small businesses as well as for home ownership. We have senior and youth services. So we run the whole gamut. And we also bring that approach when we deal with issues of community advancement in many of the neighborhoods that we're working in, with heavy presence in Brooklyn, Manhattan, and Queens. And almost the overwhelming majority of our clientele, residents, tenants are from immigrant communities. I might want to talk a little bit more, since we covered a lot of the policy and the trends from the other speakers, more about maybe how we think in terms of housing, how do we operationalize some of these issues. And in our real estate development wing, we're increasingly looking at more out of the box experimental ideas on how do we take apart what we have been building or what we have been traditionally looking at and really tool housing so that it fits the way immigrants in New York live. You heard a lot from Sheena and Anu and Michelle about how immigrants are living in our communities. They're in more overcrowded situations. They tend to live in accessory dwelling units, maybe non-compliant housing. So how do we bring that into the fold? How do we find a path so that those places are safe for and affordable for immigrant New Yorkers? So how we've been looking at that is, for example, one example we've been looking at is in Chinatown and exploring with the local council member, legal aid groups, tenant groups, and HPD, is looking at some of these kind of former manufacturing lofts. A lot of them were former garment factories in its heyday in Chinatown. But over time, in the past few decades, they also have been de facto housing. You have a lot of SROs in them. And we're in this limbo situation. You'll find that many immigrant New Yorkers are living like this. They are in places that are not, for example, zoned or allowed for housing, but yet it exists. So what do we do? And we're looking at it through, let's say, originally through the shared facilities RFEI model that HPD put out. And we're looking at ways to work with that property owner who can't really derive any good usage out of it in a kind of a manufacturing sense. That garment industry isn't coming back, and yet he has tenants who want to stay and is fighting that landlord to keep them there. And so what can we do as community developers to modernize these SROs? And we found, a way to kind of lay it out so that everyone gets windows, light, air, and then make it a little more safe, more economical. And then we also have to think about some of these units. They have varying household sizes over the years. You heard from Sheena that immigrant families have more multi-generational housing. Sometimes they also have singles, like some seniors also are either multi-generational or tend to live alone. So how do we build housing that's flexible? And we think back to a project we did with a women's shelter, where we started putting in fire-rated movable partition walls, these modular walls, and how that was flexible so that women who are fleeing abuse from their domestic partners and spouses didn't feel like if they had children, they would feel like they're abandoning them. We could increase a bedroom count by moving the walls around to tailor it to the person coming in, so that if she had more children, like she could bring them so she wouldn't be trapped in a situation where she was facing domestic violence. Many times, a lot of women stay in these dangerous situations because of the fact that they don't want to leave their children behind. Shelters may not have a space for their children. How do we bring that concept, let's say, as we think about and be more comfortable about accessory dwelling units, shared facilities, so that we do have flexible space, that they could be safe, they could be fire rated. You know, we have ways to do that and experiment with that, so that sometimes we build units, but it has varying sizes. And with this pandemic, and you see a lot of neighborhoods where there is overcrowding in existing units that, as many of the speakers mentioned, they were geared towards just nuclear households. We started thinking with a couple of other architects in actually an MIT webinar, what is like COVID resilient housing? We talked so much in the past, like after each disaster that New York faced, we had to think about, oh, what's hurricane resilient housing? Now we're talking about pandemics. If you haven't heard of pandemic resilient housing, it's because I just made that up. But then but maybe we do need to think about it. And let's say, are these like flexible housing arrangements conducive towards safe housing, for example, in a viral, pandemic situation? If we had grandparents or family members who are more susceptible to the really deleterious effects of a plague, can there be partitions where they can be part of the family unit so that there isn't social isolation, but they actually have some means of protection? So like you have a standardized unit with built-in flexibility of certain rooming situations that could have movable walls. Those are some of the just concepts we're throwing out there. And as you know, there's no codes, there's no playbook for this sort of thing. But I think it's something that as we look at immigrant housing situations, it's already happening. Some of it isn't done very safely, so let's figure out a way to do it safely and affordably for our population. It's only going to benefit all of us because we're as secure as our weakest link. As we see kind of, let's say, COVID rates rise again in the city, we need to think of better solutions, and housing is a part of that. It can be both part of the problem and the solution. One other thing I would mention about accessory dwelling units, as it points out, really, aside from new construction, a lot of it is focused around existing. Are people living in basements? How do we make that better? This would require the financial sector and CDFIs to really work, together as we're looking at our homeownership CDFI. How do we lend to homeowners to formalize and upgrade their basement so that it's safe, but in return, you're also, because we're providing a new economic value to that homeowner and security, they should have added rent protections for that tenant. So I'll leave it there. I think a lot of folks will probably have really great questions that would generate even more discussion about what we're talking about. So I'll pass it back to Jessica.
Hi, everybody. So if you have questions, enter them into the Q&A. I want to really thank all the panelists for your interesting presentations. We're really excited about the release of this report today. One thing I just want to start off with while we wait for the questions to roll in on the Q&A is why CHPC and so many of our partners have historically been focused on basement apartments, and kind of the sadness we feel that that program has been slashed in the current city budget. So to me, this is really emblematic of why the unit counting framework, where it kind of falls down on the job. So I think where it's been fantastic is that the city of New York creates more affordable housing than anywhere else in the country. And as we like to say, probably the world. So it's been an incredibly efficient, smart engine, and it really is like government doing its job in a way that I don't see anyplace else, and I don't want to minimize that. However, when it gets to something like basement apartments that affects so many homeowners of color, so many immigrant families, it affects the homeowner as well as the tenant. It is a fire safety issue as well as an economic security and a housing security issue. We haven't gotten it together. And that's because if you're looking through a unit counting framework, basement apartments is never going to be your answer because it's a bespoke answer, basement by basement by basement, homeowner by homeowner, by tenant by tenant. So that's never going to be your answer. So if your goal is create or preserve 300,000 units, the basement apartments pilot of course should have been cut. But if your interest is in helping communities of color and immigrant communities bounce back from COVID or maintain some housing stability, basement apartments is like chapter 1 of your plan. So I think one of the things we really want to focus on in the New Lens project is not to kind of dictate any particular policy, although we have a lot of good ideas that we hope the next mayor listens to, but also just to take a look in a different way to see how, if you had a different set of values and you started with those values as opposed to starting with a unit count, how will this look? So we have a question about how some of these proposed plan and ideas will reach the leaders that can enact this change. So I'll start with that, and then I want to hear from some of the other panelists. We only have a short while left for questions. We are, actively looking to speak to the campaigns and who we think the future mayor will be. We're not a political organization, we're a not-for-profit, so we're agnostic to who the next mayor is, but we just want to make sure that whoever he or she is armed with the best set of housing policies that they can be. All of you are also our megaphone. So there's 90 people on the CHPC board. There's a couple hundred people who registered here today. And so we all want to make sure that there's this kind of echo chamber that starts to build about how we want to set up a new, how we want to do things going forward. I'm going to ask Michelle this also. How do you think how do we reach the next set of leaders and really make some change on these issues?
Well, I think many of us here are part of coalitions and other efforts, whether it's, through the New York City Housing Conference, members of ANHD. I think that the main, and there's many others, right? I think that the main critique that CHPC has brought up, that the unit count has been important, but it's not enough, is something that advocates laid out during, when de Blasio first ran. And so I think it's an idea that has matured. And I think you're going to see many mayoral candidates, I think, have a deeper appreciation for the nuance that's needed.
Yeah, so, and then I'll just close on this question because we're hitting time. I do also want to encourage folks. I think, CHPC is one of these organizations that's been in New York City for 85 years. We haven't historically done a lot of coalition building because we kind of thought of ourselves as our own coalition. I think the time for that has really passed, and it's time for all of the organizations that we work with, as smart and nimble and creative as we are, we're really going to have to start working together in order to get some things done. The world has changed, and I think the stakes are too high for each of us to just kind of carve out our own little fiefdom and work from there. So I think that goes for building coalitions across organizations that are surprising sometimes. And I think it also goes for, frankly, how neighborhoods are related to each other. So if we had built sufficient housing stock in other places, then the pressures on rents in Sunset Park would not be nearly as drastic. So I think it's time for us to kind of get out of our bubbles and figure out how neighborhoods are related to each other, how housing policies affect across different neighborhoods. And so I think that's going to be a big change that all of our organizations are going to have to grapple with if we're going to make some real change in the next administration and going forward. So I'm going to close there. I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank our sponsors again, who have been so incredibly generous with us. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Share our reports widely. In 2 weeks, we have a What the F is a Feminist Housing Plan event coming up. So you can expect some profanity from me. Apologies in advance. And thank you again, everybody. Have a wonderful morning.
All right, come fly right, come. We get the job done. Come fly right, come. Come fly right, come. Come fly right, come. Immigrants, we get the job done. Come fly right, come. Come fly right, come. Come fly right, come. told tend tomorrow. We count on dead. Black and white soldiers wondering like this really means freedom. Not yet. Look how far I come. Look how far I come. Look how far I come. We get the job done.